Welcome to the Microcast, the short-form podcast from Microcosm Coaching, where we break down the science, strategy, and psychology behind smarter endurance training. Each week, we tackle a key concept in running, training, or recovery, and we give you practical tools you can apply right away, whether you're building back, leveling up, or chasing down a big goal. We keep it short, evidence-based, and grounded in real coaching experience. No hype, no fluff, just actionable insights to help you train sustainably and perform at your best. Let's get into it.
Over the next few weeks, we're going to introduce you to a few other Microcosm coaches on our podcast, so you can hear a little bit from them on who they are and what they're about.
I'm Kylie Van Horn, and I got into coaching after I graduated from college, and I went into coaching at the collegiate level at UNC Charlotte. I coached track and cross country. I have coached anywhere from the high school level up to all ages and abilities on road, track, and trail. I love coaching athletes that want to get curious about their own limits and abilities, whether that is through a race or whether that is through challenging themselves in a specific route that they want to do or a long adventure with friends. Someone that really gets curious about their limits and how they want to push themselves to try and reach their potential. The biggest problem I help people solve is navigating life stresses and injury stresses and integrating that into a training plan that is going to work and help someone be able to come back or come together to build something that works and is fun for the person. I like to ensure that an athlete is able to integrate things that mean something to them into their training so that they're able to achieve a goal, but also have that life outside of running or biking or whatever it is that they're training for. With my nutrition background, I think I kind of have this like spidey sense with people. I'm preemptively asking them how their run nutrition was or how their daily nutrition is going if there's a problem, if they're feeling fatigued, or if I'm noticing that they're super stressed. I feel like I'm always maybe hyper aware of the way that nutrition can impact performance, can impact an athlete from an injury and illness perspective, and trying to maybe take a more preventative approach so that people don't end up in a hole in the long term. My hot take would be that you actually need to run a certain number of days a week to be able to successfully, injury-free, complete a race. We can't necessarily cross-train our way to a running 100 ultra. My favorite athletes are communicative, so they actually give me feedback in their training logs, and they are curious about their own training in ways that they will ask me questions about things, and I can work with them throughout the process to help better them as an athlete. The things that set me apart would be my experience on road, track, trail, ultra. So I have a varied experience as a coach. The length of time that I've been a coach, almost 20 years, which is wild. And then the fact that I am a dietitian and a coach gives me that unique perspective. I help road and trail athletes achieve their goals by helping them understand fueling, training, and their life and how that fits into an overall balanced training plan.
If you want to get to know anyone else on our staff, reach out. We have roster spots available. microcosmcoaching@gmail.com.
Welcome to the studio, Zoe.
I'm glad to be back in the studio. It's like I hardly left, or I'm a professional podcaster, and this is actually my third time in this fake studio today.
You live in the studio.
I live in the studio.
This is your life.
This is my life. It's contained in a box and then published on the internet. I really hope I'm not undermining whatever future Zoe is trying to do by having a direct conduit between my cerebral cortex and the internet. That can't be good.
You know, I think it is good to have a direct conduit into our discussion for today around periodization
Yeah.
And the science of periodization, which is a topic that I'm really excited about. This is one of the parts of training that is most fun and creative for me as a coach. So I'm excited to get into some of the nuts and bolts around this so athletes can do this better, because it's one of these things where folks kind of just don't get it right.
They just don't do it. I think
honestly.
A lot of folks just don't do it. We're going to talk about the top mistakes that we see as coaches when it comes to periodization. And I know that that kind of sounds like a big scary word where it's like, oh my God, what does that mean? This is just how to structure your training so that you can maximize adaptations.
Yeah.
It is just training structure. You can dress it up. We're going to talk about mesocycles. We're going to use some science words, but really we're doing the nuts and bolts of how to build your training in a way that your body can actually absorb it.
So why don't we just cut through the fluff like we say we're going to do and start with some hot or nots here, and just, get it going.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for sending in hot or nots. We really appreciate it. Make sure that wherever you're listening or watching that you follow, subscribe, so that you get updates when we publish new episodes. Still have on offer, if you go and like last week's video on YouTube, TJ will prancercise. If we get 200 likes, I will film him prancercising. He has sworn to do this.
You're going to want to see that, guys.
You're going to want to see that.
You can't unsee it, though,
you can't
once
unsee
you see it.
So feel free to email us your hot or nots at microcosmcoaching@gmail.com, or comment wherever you're watching or listening. Be sure to leave us a review, because that actually helps us reach more people. The algorithm fairy is not kind to science communicators, so that's one major way you can actually help us reach more people. So
be kind and like and subscribe. By the way, I'm just going to come right in because I'm excited for the first hot or not topic.
Yeah.
I can't believe nobody has brought this to us. I can't believe it's taken this long.
First up is Nomio.
Nomio, get that broccoli out.
So what this is a concentrated shot of broccoli sprout extract. The active ingredient is isothiocyanates, or ITCs, which are compounds that are found in a lot of cruciferous vegetables. The reason that this is really hot right now in endurance sports is because it was developed by researchers at the Karolinska Institute and Swedish School of Sport and Health Sciences, which is the real deal. This is actually the same group behind the foundational beet juice nitrate research, which also has turned out to be pretty legit. So that's not nothing. So to peek under the hood at what we think is happening with these broccoli shots is that ITCs appear to reduce blood lactate during submaximal exercise. There was a 2025 preprint that actually found a 12% reduction in submax testing. ITCs also activate the NRF2 system, which regulates the body's own antioxidant enzymes. So the company behind Nomio, which has funded all of this research, that's a little bit of a should perk your ears, argues that this amplifies rather than suppresses the training adaptation signal, which is important because a lot of times training produces oxidative stress. And so there's this sort of argument that taking in too many antioxidants will tamp down on that training signal. Nomio says that this doesn't happen with their particular antioxidants. There was an independent study by muscle physiologist David Hood at York University that also found significant mitochondrial biogenesis in fibers exposed to ITCs. Hood had actually never heard of Nomio when a journalist called him to ask him about this paper, so there's a little more independence in that particular finding. But here's where I get really skeptical.
I jump in with the skepticism.
Get in there.
Because I think
the skeptic.
I think this is ridiculous. This supplement.
I think that ridiculous is not an accurate synthesis of the best available data. But I'll let you go.
Here's why. We don't have a peer-reviewed study on this yet.
Yep.
We only have a starting point. We have absolutely no conclusions. And Hood's work was based on isolated muscle fibers in a test tube, not actual live humans running on treadmills in labs.
I'll be honest that I am not a muscle in a test tube.
No, you're not. So that's kind of why I'm like, yeah, it's nice. It's kind of ridiculous, though. Like, I wouldn't be paying for these supplements, which are on the market now, when we don't really have any actual peer-reviewed evidence that supports using them. It's just another one of those things where it's like, here's a silver bullet.
Well,
You can maybe perform a little bit better at lactate threshold.
the mechanism is genuinely interesting.
Yeah,
I
sure.
also think the antioxidant blunting question is real because high-dose antioxidants can suppress that oxidative stress signal that your body needs to adapt.
Right.
Where Nomio says that they're mild pro-oxidants, not antioxidants. That's interesting.
That's an interesting...
But it's not been proven.
Right.
So the mechanism here is real. It hasn't been tested in humans. So where I come down is not, this is ridiculous. I would say more research is definitely needed, is warranted, would be great, would be really interesting. Would love to see more independent research not funded by Nomio. And I am saving my money at this point in time.
Yeah.
So
I mean, you're on the lukewarm.
there's no there. I think the mechanism is real. We haven't seen it in humans. I want to see a lot more science before I get excited about people shelling out their hard-earned money to raw dog broccoli.
All right, you heard it here. We got a not hot and we've got a lukewarm, pending more info. So get your call your local congressman, tell him to study this stuff. All right.
Yeah, that's really where I want our tax dollars going.
Hot or not?
Happy tax day.
I think this next one is pretty funny too. Hot or not? Apex Cool Labs Narwhal. Am I pronouncing that right?
That's correct. So this is, thanks Coach James Nance, one of our marathon and cycling specialists, sent this to us. What this is a sort of space-age palm cooling technology. So to, in good faith, look into this. The underlying science of palm cooling is real, dates back to the 1990s. Stanford biologist Craig Heller and Dennis Graham developed it for DARPA, which is the military research arm, also responsible for ketones. So you guys have a lot to answer for. And then tested it on athletes. So the physiology here is that your palms contain glabrous skin with direct artery vein connections called AVAs. So those are sort of like your body's natural radiators. The idea is that cooling them dumps heat from the core without chilling working muscles. This is important because the temperature has to be cool and not cold, because anything below 50 degrees actually causes vasoconstriction and shuts the whole process down. So it's a bit of a physiological balancing act. The narwhals claim, also that name, dear God, claim to hold that
Seriously.
50 to 60 degrees sweet spot. So where the evidence and the research is strongest is potentially there could be applications in resistance training or intermittent sports with built-in rest. Research from Stanford showed meaningful increases in work volume and strength gains when athletes cooled their palms between sets. Do you want to be, not devils, do you want to be narwhal advocate here?
Well, I think
Anti-narwhal?
I think some of these claims are a little shaky. There's a couple of Stanford quotes that maybe have been taken out of context, like you're going to get 22% strength increase.
Such as on the Feed website.
Yeah, or it's like better than steroids. But I think the context here is really important. This is obviously taken out of context and it's referencing a very specific kind of like heat stress scenario. I think the application to continuous endurance training is kind of weak at this point. We don't really have any studies that back this up, and you can't hold these little
they weigh
devices.
several pounds. They look like dumbbells.
You can't
almost
use them while you're running Western States or your Boston qualifier. So the endurance evidence there, I think it's not great for us runners, honestly, and it's not logistically feasible or practical to use this. So for me, I think the underlying verdict on this, whether it's hot or not, is like, yeah, the science is pretty hot.
There's a plausible mechanism.
Right. But unfortunately, the application is kind of like not hot.
Which is where a lot of these things live, of like the jump from plausible mechanism to you need to spend money on this thing is huge. And I think there's a lot of hurdles to clear in between there and there.
Let's talk about the pelvic floor and pelvic floor PT, because this is...
I think 100% of the hosts of this podcast have done pelvic floor PT.
Yeah. I
So
actively do it for my piriformis issue.
yeah. So I think just to myth bust up front, pelvic floor PT is not just for postpartum moms. I think that's a big myth that we see as coaches. The pelvic floor, I call it my meat hammock, and it makes TJ really upset.
You're supposed to call it the core canister. That's
Core
like
canister.
that's like the
Yeah.
actual way
Yeah.
he would describe it.
I like
That's
meat
better.
hammock.
I like that. Core canister. Let's go with that.
So it's this group of stabilizing muscles at the base of the pelvis, and it has several jobs that it has to do, especially simultaneously during running. It stabilizes the pelvis, it absorbs ground impact forces, it supports pelvic organs, and it coordinates with the diaphragm on every single foot strike. So the pelvic floor is doing the most.
It does so much.
And here's what I see a lot as a coach, particularly with female athletes. Actually, up to 40% of female athletes will experience urinary leakage during training or competition. That rate isn't specific to postpartum athletes, by the way.
Right.
That's just people reporting it. A scoping review of male athletes actually found that they might have higher rates of lower urinary tract symptoms than non-athletic men in the same age. So running spikes intra-abdominal pressure hundreds of times per mile. So this is an area where we see a lot of issue, and because of the sort of embarrassment factor of a lot of this, or, well, I'm not, and this is like from personal experience, I guess I'll just get candid for a second. I was having issues where I felt like I would really lose power on downhills and feel like I had to pee. And I saw like 3 different doctors who had like no idea what was going on. And then finally one of them was like, I think you just need to see a pelvic floor PT. And I was like, well, I've never had kids, so why?
Let me jump in with the why, because what a lot of runners miss is that pelvic floor dysfunction doesn't always present as like, leakage in your urinary tract. It's showing up as chronic hip flexor tension, reoccurring IT band issues, lower back pain that doesn't respond to normal treatment, piriformis issues like I've had. And this is because the pelvic floor is, connected to the diaphragm, the hip stabilizers, and the lumbar spine. And like you mentioned earlier, it's kind of like the first thing that's absorbing all those impact forces. So if your deep core isn't strong and functioning correctly, then your muscles, everything kind of on the outside of that system has to work double time to allow you to continue to run. And then you start to see these overuse injuries.
Yeah. I think it's also important to mention that it's not just or always about weakness. And this is where I think really seeing a pelvic
functionality
specialist is ideal. Like, I had an amazing pelvic floor PT. I think a lot of postpartum athletes get linked up with these folks. If I was president, literally everyone on earth would get free pelvic floor PT, because I really do think it is just that important and beneficial. But an overactive or hypertonic pelvic floor is actually extremely common in high mileage runners. And this was the camp that I fell into. And the treatment here is not Kegels, because you're basically just tightening something that is already like very tight.
You can't tighten something that's already tight.
Yeah, you can't treat a tight pelvic floor by telling someone to flex harder. So a really skilled, specific pelvic floor PT will be able to differentiate between those presentations. So some research I pulled is that supervised pelvic floor rehab reduces incontinence episodes by about 60% compared to unsupervised programs.
Wow.
So I really think this is first-line treatment, and there's no meaningful adverse effects other than the fact that because I have Garbaggio health insurance, this ran me hundreds of dollars.
I mean, I think this is pretty hot for everybody, because working on your deep core is a really important part of having the proper muscular balance to be able to do your endurance, sport of choice, specifically with running because of the impact forces. One of the things to think about here is like, if you've had unresolved issues like hip issues, IT band issues, maybe you've been dealing with something, similar to me, where it's like, why, do I have this nerve issue and a piriformis issue? Why is that tightening up? Like, it's not a strength issue. Let me look under the hood and see if perhaps it's a pelvic floor thing. Like, similar to me, like things are able to get tight, but they're not able to loosen up, so that the functionality is not there.
So I think we're going to say that's very hot.
Yeah.
Endorse working with a professional who understands your pelvic floor. And again, I just cannot stress this enough. Regardless of gender, however you show up in the world, pelvic floor PT is a pretty good thing to look into if you have any of these presentations or unresolved issues. Not just for moms, although if you are a postpartum runner, this is an extremely high ROI.
Necessary.
Like, don't buy broccoli shots, don't buy a cold plunge, go see a pelvic floor PT would be my message.
All right, let's get into the main conversation for today, the science of periodization and how to actually structure your training year. So why does this matter? This matters because most runners follow a plan, but very few runners actually understand the architecture behind why their plan is built the way it's built.
Right.
And periodization is one of these words that gets kind of thrown around a lot. Like, I hired a coach because they periodize training. We have different phases of training. Like, I've heard, base or build or recovery block. Cool. Those are really cool buzzwords. But most athletes don't know what that means. So we want to fill in those gaps of knowledge right now and also talk to you about, how you might want to set up a year. What are the actual phases of periodization that can help you and why are we going to do them? And so adding this to your toolkit is going to allow you to, achieve a higher level of training specificity.
I also do, like, if you're self-coach or even if we're your coaches, hi, thanks for listening.
Cheers.
Once you understand the logic, I really think it helps athletes make better, more autonomous decisions in real time, not just executing workouts, but really understanding what the underlying intent is. So, TJ, can you tell us what periodization actually is?
I think a really simple definition is key here. Periodization is simply the intentional organization of training over time.
Yep.
So it's dividing your training into phases throughout the training year. You as an athlete, kind of get to define how long your training year is.
Yeah.
That could be 3 months, it could be 6, it could be 12, it could be 18 months. It totally depends on what your goals are, and what you're trying to achieve. But I would say that would be the basic definition of this.
It's the opposite of willy-nilly.
Yeah.
So this is attributed to Soviet sports scientist Leo, and I'm so sorry to Leo's descendants. I'm not going to get this. Matveyev in the 1950s, 60s, who was analyzing the training of various Olympic athletes and just sort of was able to formalize and collate what good coaches had been intuiting for decades. So the foundational biology here is that you stress the body, allow recovery, and the body adapts to a higher level, rinse and repeat. Episode over. Thanks for listening. Be sure to make TJ Prancer size. No, but this is the engine of all athletic improvement. So there's the alarm phase or the stress, which is the actual workout, or the stimulus. I like to use stimulus.
Yeah.
I feel like stress freaks athletes out. There's the resistance phase where the body adapts, the exhaustion phase, which is what happens if you do not adapt and you never recover. So the companion principle to this is SAID, or specific adaptations to imposed demands. Do things on purpose to get an outcome. Your body gets good at exactly what you train it to do. So this is why just running more and doing whatever, not having structured training or doing whatever your local track club is doing on any given Tuesday, Wednesday workout has a ceiling, and why the type of stress really matters.
Yeah. I think there's a common, misconception here that, we can get out of the way early in the podcast, is that fitness is not built during a hard workout. It's built during the recovery that happens after a hard workout. So I had an athlete recently ask me, like, can I get super compensation if I do a hard workout on Wednesday and then a harder workout on Saturday? Won't I theoretically be ready to perform at a higher level on the Saturday workout because I've stressed my body a lot on Wednesday and then I've had a couple recovery days? And so, like, all of a sudden those adaptations are going to be available for me to, like, hit the next level in the next session. And I think that is sometimes a hard thing to answer because it really depends on you.
You're not, even if you felt better on that Saturday, which you most likely wouldn't because you'd be carrying some amount, because
Right.
the idea is to provoke fatigue. The adaptations the only quick adaptation is neuromuscular, and you can kind of get that in a few seconds, but that's not a fitness adaptation, or it's sort of, that's a pretty superficial adaptation. You can get it quickly, you can lose it quickly, but in a, like, actual adaptations from workouts take days, weeks, months to realize.
Right. And so when we think about supercompensation, we're really thinking about the body's ability to then just handle additional load.
Mhm.
So we can keep that stress and rest cycle going. And we have this progressive overload of stress that at the end of the cycle, then once there's even more recovery and we are going to do a race or something, that training is really available to you.
Yeah, so I want to just touch on some of the vocabulary that we'll be using. Again, the attempt here is like, one of my pet peeves as a science communicator is when people intentionally use too many big words. That's like, to me, a sign they have no idea what the hell they're
I
talking
think
about.
this falls into that category for me as a coach.
People will see these words, so I want to define them.
100%.
If you, like, I think that for me, like, imposters use complicated words to describe simple ideas. Experts use simple words to describe complicated ideas. That being said, these are nested in time frames. So what doesn't change, so that the what that we're talking about doesn't change, just the lens we're looking through. So number one is macro cycle, which is your full training season, typically the span from one peak race to another, 3 to 12 months, bird's eye view. So for a lot of runners, you might have 1 to 2 macro cycles in a year. For ultra athletes, the macro cycle might span an entire calendar year with 1 or 2 A races, but this is just big picture talking. A mesocycle is a distinct training block within the macro cycle, so it's the Russian nesting doll. These are usually 3 to 6 weeks with a specific physiological focus. So that you could have a base mesocycle, a build mesocycle, peak mesocycle, taper mesocycle, recovery, transition mesocycle. Each one has a different volume intensity relationship, but it's just slightly smaller than a macro cycle, bigger than a microcycle, which is where we're headed next. A microcycle, just a single training week. For a lot of athletes, this is somewhere between 5 and 10 days. A lot of times with most of my athletes, do a 7-day training microcycle because that's how a lot of us organize our lives. So this is the really granular level of structure. So good microcycle design should protect the mesocycle. Bad microcycle design, which is the sort of gray zone training, undermines it. So I think that the reason this is important to talk about practically is because when an athlete says, I feel flat, understanding where they are in the mesocycle, potentially the microcycle, often explains it. Fatigue mid-block is not a problem. That's a feature, not a bug.
Right. That's part of the plan.
Yeah.
Okay. Training intensity distribution. And so we're going to talk about a couple models here. But I think before we talk about the periodization structures, we have to address, obviously, these intensity zones, because the debate about how to periodize is really a debate about how to distribute intensity across time and across these meso and meso cycles.
Can you walk us through a 5-zone model briefly here?
Sure. So in a 5-zone model, starting at the bottom, you have zone 1.
Yep.
That's going to be our recovery effort, a very, very low effort. Zone 2 is going to be our easy running, and that's going to go up until basically your first ventilatory threshold. You can call that LT1 or lactate.
And that's where your breathing really picks up. Like there's a notable physiological sort of threshold there. Right.
And above that, you start accumulating lactate, essentially. And then the higher up you go, the closer you get to LT2, that lactate becomes something that you can no longer shuttle. And in the middle there is your zone 3.
Gray zone.
That's the
steady state.
Gray zone.
Usually avoid.
Moderate or race-specific training. You can kind of think about that as like marathon effort. And then you have your zone, like zone 4, but under LT2 still. That's where we're going to be doing our threshold work. And then anything above lactate threshold, we're in VO2 max territory, zone 5, and like kind of upper zone 4 into zone 5 and
perfect
anaerobic.
So this is where some of the models diverge. And the question becomes, how much of your training time should each zone get? So One answer to this question is pyramidal distribution. And this is the most commonly used structure in a lot of real world running, and one of the one that I feel that most recreational athletes default to without totally realizing it. So zone 1 is the biggest slice, 75 to 80% of time. Zone 2 gets a pretty solid chunk, 10 to 20%. Zone 3 in a lot of times is present but small. So
Oh, but we should just let everyone know we're talking about a 3-zone.
that was a 3-zone model. Yeah, 'cause
not 5.
The thing that's tough is a lot of research is based on the 3-zone model, but coaches prefer the 5-zone model because it's a lot more intuitive for athletes.
Right.
So, so basically, a lot of time running easy, some time moderate, very little time hard.
Yeah.
So pyramid in shape, biggest base, tapered at the top.
And I think this is the dominant pattern among a lot of elite distance runners as well. And research shows this is well supported, particularly for runners doing high volume. It kind of like lumps into that 80-20 rule where we're talking about in a 5-zone model doing 80% of training in zone 1 and zone 2. And then 20% of the training is some kind of speed work, faster than moderate or threshold work, or even faster 5K, 10K VO2 max work. And I think why this is important is elite runners who follow this plan in this model, they can accumulate a large amount of time in zone 1 and zone 2, which tends to equate to better performance gains.
Yeah.
More mileage equals better performance in a lot of cases.
Yeah. So again, just a lot of time spent running very, very easy, and then intentional smaller amounts of time spent at intensity. Don't overthink the pyramidal element of it all. Now let's talk about polarization.
Yes.
What does this mean?
So this is how you distribute your training intensity. And essentially it means we have to have days that are hard enough to provoke adaptations. And we have to have days that are easy enough to recover from those hard days.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to be using the 3-zone model here. I know it's inconsistent after we just introduced the 5-zone model, but again, the circle that we have to square here
Right.
is that the 5-zone model is really the one that makes sense when communicating with athletes. Unfortunately, science disagrees with me. Fine, whatever, science, your call, and uses the 3-zone model. So this is roughly 80% of time in zone 1, 5% time zone 2, 15% zone 3. Those exact numbers are going to vary by study.
Right.
Here's where you see the Norwegian model, which is very trendy and fun online, come into play with cross-country skiing. Jacob Ingebrigtsen, often held up as like the gold standard here, though it's worth noting that those athletes are often training 20 to 30 hours a week, which changes the math, and they are not busy parents with full-time jobs, and that is a notable wrench to throw into the whole equation. So the physiological rationale here is that zone 2 creates fatigue without maximally stimulating the key adaptation pathways. High intensity work drives 2 distinct signaling pathways: calcium dependent pathways from volume and AMPK pathways from intensity. So the theory is that polarized training maximizes both without crossing into the fatigue accumulation that zone 2 creates. So
Right.
trying to minimize that thing that we often see with amateur athletes of a lot of time in the gray zone, where you're running too hard to recover and you're limiting your ability to accumulate more volume, but you're not actually running hard enough to get fitness. So you're running just enough to get tired in a way that limits your ability to gain fitness.
Yeah. And there's an interesting study here from Stalg and Sperlich, which cited
Scandinavians crush research on this.
Yeah. I mean, they have a very
they're very passionate about
deep
this
history of studying this stuff because of all of the cross country skiers that they have in their in their cultures. But what's interesting here is this 9-week study showed that polarized training outperformed threshold high volume heat approaches.
high intensity interval.
Right. HIIT approaches in VO2 max gains in well-trained athletes. So I think that's really something to think about and consider when you're organizing and you're periodizing training.
Yeah, so there was a 2024 meta-analysis in sports medicine that I think is a really cool paper, and I'll link to it in the show notes, that found both polarized and pyramidal improved endurance performance compared to other models. And crucially, advantages over each other were relatively small. And I think, I guess to bury the lead here, kind of awkwardly exactly halfway into the episode, my overall message would be like, don't overthink this stuff. The big message here is have a plan and make sure you run easy days easy and hard days hard. Like,
Yeah.
don't get bogged down in the pyramidal and don't become like the Julia Roberts meme of like floating. Like, you don't have to get Rain Man on this. Just be intentional and execute intentionally.
And try to avoid the gray zone.
Yeah.
Unless for some reason your event really calls for that specificity.
Yeah.
Like if you're a marathon runner.
Another thing that you'll see floating around out there, but I feel like this is sort of like the training equivalent of like a cassette tape. Like, it's getting increasingly rare these days, which is the threshold mixed intensity model. And this is the kind of classic collegiate running model. Intervals Tuesday, tempo Thursday, long run Sunday, repeat forever. So there's a lot of zone 2 concentration there. This is where a lot of runners end up living without knowing it. It's not always wrong for less experienced athletes early in their development with some amount of supervision, but the research just doesn't favor it long term compared to these other approaches, pyramidal and polarized. So what becomes the issue here is that fatigue math of zone 2 is expensive enough to compromise recovery from hard days and the quality of easy days without the distinct adaptation signals of either zone 1 or zone 3.
Yeah, and again, I think the bottom line on training intensity distribution is that there's only one right intensity distribution. That's not true. That's a myth. The research consensus is genuinely a lot more nuanced than that. We could have pyramidal, we could have polarized. We do have these hybrid models like you might see in a lot of collegiate programs. And really, it's about what is the right approach for the individual at the time that they're in their career and the event that they are participating in. I think, excuse me, the cleaner takeaway is protect your zone 1 in a zone 3 model. In a 5-zone model, protect your zones 1 and 2. So it's essentially easy days, easy. That's going to allow you to work harder on your hard days, get a little bit more out of those quality sessions, and ensure that you're doing the work that actually allows you to have adaptations long term.
Yeah. So gray zone remains the enemy, whatever system you're following. So I wanted to talk a little bit about block versus mix periodization. And these are just concepts of how you organize your intensity over time. So,
oh yeah, getting into the good stuff.
This is where it gets like, now we're going to layer the intensity distribution question onto the time structure question. So buckle up. Mixed periodization, which is also called concurrent or undulating, though I don't see those very often because I feel like if a coach was like,
hybrid,
we're going to do undulating, I'd be like, whoa, dog. You do workouts at multiple intensities every single week, every single month. So this is intervals plus tempo plus long run week after week.
That's like the collegiate example you used earlier.
It's kind of more of a trail mix of intensity.
Let's throw everything at you that we can and hope for a good outcome. That's how I think about that.
Then there is block periodization, which is where you concentrate a specific type of intensity stress into a defined phase, then shift into another type of stress. So a classic block sequence for runners, and this is what depending on the event, because another principle is you go less specific to more specific, getting closer to the event. Another principle to balance with that is aerobic base block, threshold tempo block, VO2 max interval block, race specific peak block, taper.
Well, and that's the cool thing about block periodization is you can insert any block wherever you want.
Because it's so specific.
Right. Depending on what the athlete's needs are. So like a really interesting thing that I did in my training this year was ahead of the Chianti race. I actually did race specific training further out because we were at our boot camp in California.
Right. Yeah.
And so we kept my volume high for like 3 mesocycles of essentially in that one period because three mesocycles, one
Meso, like
mesocycle.
Mesoamerica.
Right. I understand what it is. And just because we were going to do that camp, but that camp didn't fall in alignment with really where my race was.
Yeah.
So then we actually reverse engineered it, and we did like threshold and then VO2 right before my race, which isn't a typical way to structure block training, but you can insert any block where you want it based on
a lot of factors. Again, like there are general principles here. Oftentimes the athletes I'm coaching are racing enough that I structure, and I coach so many ultra athletes that it's like we do VO2 max, then threshold, then race specific. Like if they're training particularly for a 100-mile race. So again, you want to balance those with like the reality of an athlete's life. Like if they're going through an intense time at work, maybe that's not when you throw the hardest training block at them or the highest volume. And the argument here is that concentrated stress in one physiological domain leads to deeper adaptation in that domain before you shift focus. And I think, again, the caveat here is that your body isn't a perfectionist. Yes, these are rules that according to that when you look at the evidence should guide how you structure things, but that doesn't mean if you can't get a perfect mesocycle macro, like don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough intention, if that makes sense.
So a 2019 systemic review and meta-analysis by Molman, Ofsteng, and Rustenad,
shout out to Norway,
compared block to traditional periodization across multiple sports. And while VO2 max advantages for block were modest, block periodization showed greater advantages at threshold intensity in real-world performance outcomes. So that's a pretty strong, I would say, conclusion for a lot of our athletes out there who are actually going out and competing.
Yeah, looking at the research, I will say, I think it's harder to find studies where traditional periodization outperforms block, and it's easier to find the reverse. But the big caveat here with a lot of this science is that the studies have very small sample sizes and moderate methodological quality. For instance, one of the studies I cited early on in this research was on kayakers, and that is of limited importance to amateur runners, so the signal is definitely consistent enough to act on, but not so overwhelming that you should treat block periodization as dogma, and like definitely not permission to get weird in someone's DMs about this shit.
So let me ask you, because we're going to go into why this matters for ultra runners and master athletes. I want to ask you, you've made the shift to block style periodization in your own training. Over, let's just say, the last 18 months. You were working with David Roche. I think it's well known by looking at his plans that he puts out on the internet that he has more of this collegiate style mixed or hybrid approach, where you might be doing 10K work during the week and then throw in some Z3 moderate steady state on a weekend. And there's not a whole lot of periodization. It's a lot more speed development all year round. There's not as specific. It's a big change for an athlete to change training styles. But now you've got some really long races under your belt now. I'm wondering, what you notice in those changes.
I'll be
the good and the bad, everything.
Candid. So, I also don't have a deep athletic history, and it must be noted that David's hybrid approach helped me get second at Leadville with zero. I mean, not zero. Yeah, I was not a collegiate runner. Literally didn't make my high school cross country team. I specifically think his short form speed work really helped me develop speed, turnover, and economy because I didn't have a very deep running history. So that's one of the reasons I really think that approach worked. I think the downside was that my volume remained relatively low and limited, and now I'm learning that I have significant more capacity for volume. Now that I'm doing more volume, less time at intensity, a lot more specific work, I'll say that the challenge, in addition to I'm on average doing 4 to 5 more hours of training a week, which
that's a big step up.
It's big. I feel great. I'm healthy. I haven't had an injury.
So healthy.
Knock on wood. I'm also more in love with running than ever. I think that's important. It stays very fun for me. I love long runs and I compete at long races. I am thriving. The challenge is because I'm doing less speed work and more race specific work, which when you race like me is slow as hell, or feels really slow
Right.
and long. I feel slower in my training. I'm accumulating more fatigue, so I feel like my runs and workouts are less flashy. When I was with David, also because I wasn't holding myself accountable, we didn't have accountability via the data, I would run a lot of my workouts too hard.
Yeah.
I knew
sure.
that. I should have stopped. I'm an adult. I was in charge the whole time. This is one of the reasons I really do spend a lot of time with my athletes going into the data so we can avoid Zoeing your workout.
Don't Zoe it.
Don't Zoe it. And since I've moved to this block periodized approach, I have PR'd every race and every distance that I've run from the marathon to the 100.
I mean,
so
that's
one more data point.
yeah. Also, sometimes changing approaches,
You'll get
a lot of gains because it's very novel
because
stress.
it's novel stress.
So I just think it's really cool to contrast those
Yeah.
two different approaches, and why, again, block makes sense, particularly for ultra runners, is ultra runners are, they're performing in a very narrow intensity band,
Yeah.
zone 1 and usually like a low zone 2.
Yeah.
If you're a really, really well-developed runner,
Yeah.
you're going to be running zone 2 in 50-mile races,
Right.
100K, and maybe, some 100-milers depending on the terrain.
Yeah.
But for most folks at these race distances, you're really 4 out of 10 RPE. You're going much slower than sometimes our egos feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
So spending time developing VO2 max capacity, it is important for a few reasons, but you're never going to race at that effort level. So if all you do is spend your time training that capacity, you're missing out on the real opportunity, which is getting better in zone 1 and zone 2. Of course, if all you do is run in zone 1, zone 2, you're probably going to get pretty slow over time. So there's, again, insert the block periodization.
Yeah.
So block structure lets you say, okay, let's work on this specific competency or capacity now. We're going to build that, and then we're going to layer another adaptation type on top of that.
Yeah.
So we're not doing two things simultaneously. We're focusing on maximizing one at a time.
How do you feel when you've shifted approaches?
I like it because I think it's almost more psychological for me though, because I love working on competence.
Yeah.
I like developing specific skills. And so continually trying to refine at one workout type is something that interests me. Like that works for my mastery approach. I do feel like some of the limitations maybe around block is that there's not enough time reinforcing speed.
Yeah.
Which is something that I personally spend time with my athletes doing.
Yeah.
So I will do blocks. I will do a mesocycle of speed development and economy work with athletes, particularly at the beginning of the year, because what good is it to do threshold work if that work's not coming on top of the most efficient chassis that you possibly have?
Yeah. Couldn't put it better myself.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think the reason,
as you can tell, we're not like extremely dogmatic about this, right? Like it is, there's more than one way to skin a cat. You can skin it hybrid or block. I do think that for masters athletes, it's important to note because your recovery capacity decreases with age. That means the stress recovery math changes. So concentrating stress in a block, then genuinely backing off produces better outcomes than a constant mid-level stimulus that the body struggles to fully recover from. And I think that it's important to say that the residual fitness principle is that once a quality is developed, it takes far less stimulus to maintain it than to build it. So a block approach will bank that adaptation, then maintains it with lower volume while developing that next quality.
What's the practical middle ground here, Zoe? I guess we could call it the hybrid approach.
Yeah.
We've kind of buried some of the lead on this, but pure block periodization as written in textbooks is rarely what we actually see in coaching or how coaches actually implement this stuff.
Because I don't coach lab rats, you know?
Right. You're not in a test tube.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean we throw everything out and go on vibes. It means that the job of the coach is to take what we know from the evidence, to take what we see in the studies and adapt that and figure out how to apply it in real world scenarios.
Yeah.
So what most evidence informed coaching actually looks like in practice is block leaning hybrid, structured mesocycles with a dominant physiological theme, but maintenance work for other qualities persists throughout,
Yeah.
like doing strides in a threshold block or doing strides in an aerobic base block, right? Like, I think it's pretty intuitive that you are, necessarily always targeting more than one adaptation, because it's all going to live sort of in some amount of aerobic work. Because in a VO2 max block, you're not spending all your time at VO2 max. You're still spending time at an intensity that develops your aerobic base, even if that's not the primary focus.
I think a good example of this is for some of my more advanced athletes that tend to race faster but longer ultras, is when we do get into those race specific phases of training. When we have our deload weeks, I may inject a speed maintenance workout, something that's only maybe 12 to 16 minutes of total time at intensity. So it's not a lot of intensity. The purpose of the workout isn't to build capacity. It's just to stay sharp, to stay in touch with their speed, because when they go into an ultra where there's a lot of running, to not be in touch with that sharpness is a disadvantage.
Yeah.
But we can't just ram that home for the entire race specific block, because then we're going to sacrifice time at actual race intensities.
It's always a cost benefit analysis.
But that's the fun part for a coach, I think, is to be creative in that way and to learn about the kind of how their athletes respond and like what actually helps them feel really sharp and ready to go before a race. Some athletes, they don't need that sharpening. They're like, I'm all set with just steady state work and a few strides.
Yeah. So I think the key word here is emphasis and not exclusivity. So let's talk about what this means for actually how to build your training year. So my first point would be to start with the macro. Pick your A race and work backwards. The race distance and demands should dictate your phase sequence and duration. So that first phase is usually going to be general prep or base building. So focusing on aerobic volume, tissue load tolerance, movement efficiency, strength foundation, heavily pyramidal, very low, very easy efforts. And what's happening physiologically here is that mitochondrial density, stroke volume, capillary development, fat oxidation capacity, tendon and connective tissue adaptation. This is typically the longest phase, and this is like aerobic adaptations are the ones that take the longest to develop. It's super slow. So this can look like 8 to 16 weeks depending on current fitness and time available. So the biggest mistake that I see here is athletes adding an intensity too early. And I think it's always important to say that I got bored is not a physiological reason to start throwing in random tempo runs in week 3. Physiology don't care about your feelings.
No, unfortunately it doesn't. Phase 2, you could think about it as like a building phase, specific preparation. It's going to depend a little bit on the demands of your event, but for road runners, that might mean a lot of threshold work. For ultra runners, maybe that means sustained aerobic output and time on feet, more steady state work. In your intensity distribution, it's gonna shift, in these phases depending on what those goals are. And so what's happening physiologically is lactate threshold, might come up. Your ability to shuttle lactate at higher effort levels could improve. You're going to have more mitochondrial efficiency at these higher intensities, more buffering capacity, better running economy. And this phase of training, again, depends on the race, but could last anywhere from 6 to 10 or even 12 weeks, depending on the goal. And I think common mistakes here are often like gray zone training. So for example, too much moderate running instead of like threshold work.
Yeah. Easy runs become not easy when your legs are tired from workouts. Yeah. Distribution gets muddy and things get less polarized.
I think that's a good point too, Zoe, is like we might be in the gray zone because we're just running our easy runs too hard.
Yeah, because this is like a big thing I'll see when athletes are like, I'm tired, but they feel like addicted or married to a certain pace on their easy runs. Like, it's unacceptable for me to go slower than a 10-minute mile. And no, it's not. Like, that should always change. That's why we use RPE and not like, you're not an abacus, you know? So the second phase is or third phase is race specific or your peak phase. So again, like there's a lot of ways to do this. When I'm training athletes for ultras, it's almost the inverse of this until the end, which is when you're really focused on the demands of your specific event. So race simulation, sharpening, race pace confidence. This is where you want to integrate specific skills, like really making sure you have dialed in your fueling. If you're running on technical terrain, run on technical terrain, really trying to get on race similar terrain as much as possible. If you're doing a hilly marathon, run hilly road routes. So for ultras, this will include back-to-back long runs, race terrain, specific fueling. For road runners, it's a lot more time of race work, race pace work, progressive long runs, potential lactate threshold maintenance, depending on the event. And this is usually much closer to the event. To put a number to it, again, this is all flexible, 3 to 5 weeks out, though a lot of those specific skills you'll be targeting, ideally, more than 3 weeks before your race.
I think for ultra runners, it's more of that 4 to 8 week period.
Yeah.
At least in my coaching because of the timeline for adaptations.
Yeah.
Phase 4 is our taper. Volume's going to drop between 30 and 50%. Intensity is maintained. If you're an ultra runner, you're still getting in time on race specific terrain. And the physiology here is you're not resting into your fitness. You're more just you're just clearing accumulated fatigue. So the fitness you have becomes visible.
Yep.
That mask that goes over our fitness when we're at the peak of phase 3, we start to clear that up, and then you start to feel better and you're ready to fire on race day. I think it's a common mistake here is athletes just panic during their taper and they either add miles or they take miles away when we really need the taper to be pretty specific in order to not be flat on race day.
If you don't do enough, you'll feel flat. If you do too much, you'll be fatigued. If we have to err on one side, I'd rather feel a little bit flat than a little bit fatigued.
Right. Like
it's a balancing act.
I had an athlete once tell me like, I have to take the day before my race off. And I like to do a hike instead.
Nope. Oh my God. That just like a panic.
I'm just like, oh no, please.
I want to make sure I'm tired and slow.
The worst thing you can do is something that's not race specific.
The worst thing you can do is make yourself tired and not get those neuromuscular adaptations. I like the day before races, kind of whenever the race is a 30-minute morning shakeout with potentially some surges depending on the athlete in the event.
Yeah. Let's just quickly hit phase 5. So what do we do after the A race? That's our transition season. That's our recovery.
Yep.
We have done podcasts on this in the past. So just, search for those, but it's non-negotiable. You are fatigued after these races. Take the time to recover. The duration should be 1 to 4 weeks, depending on the race distance.
Yep.
And that's before getting back into training. So if you're running 100 miles, probably up to 4 weeks of total recovery. If you're running a marathon, you might be more 1 to 2 weeks, but take the time that you need so you can fully recover and then actually get back into your training without carrying all this fatigue around with you.
Yeah, this is where long-term training is actually protected. Athletes who skip or neglect this phase you're just stealing from your future self. So let's talk about some of the most common mistakes that we see. And the biggest one, and we've already name-checked this a couple of times, is just spending too much time in that gray zone. The most ubiquitous error, this is the error that pays our mortgage. Easy days aren't truly easy. Hard days aren't truly hard. The body gets a consistent kind of like moderate stimulus that creates fatigue much faster than it creates adaptation. So the distribution stays permanently muddled. It's like the opposite of Goldilocks.
Just run easier, my friends. Okay. Mistake number 2, skipping or rushing the base building phase. So building tissue tolerance is boring. It's not that fun to run a lot of easy miles, do a bunch of strides, not do big, fancy, sexy workouts. But in the end, if you do this work, you're likely going to have the foundation to do bigger training later. Athletes who typically race and then take a lot of time off, skip these phases, and then they get hurt a lot more. Athletes who do a big race and then get right back into training really quickly tend to skip these phases. They get hurt a lot more. And we're also missing out on some of just the easy aerobic base building mileage that you get from this kind of training that over, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and more years really makes the difference.
Yeah. I also think a mistake I see a lot is stacking intensity in adjacent days. I think especially for less advanced athletes or masters athletes, this is really not good. Mixed intensity models can make that really easy to do by accident. So 2 quality sessions within 24 to 36 hours compromises both of those sessions. Spread things out. Recovery runs should be recovery runs.
I couldn't agree more. Number 4 here, treating every week like peak week. The body needs oscillation. I hear this a lot from athletes who push back against wanting to deload, saying,
This used to be me for sure.
right, I'm not fatigued. I'm like, dude, look at the training you've done for the past 3 or 4 weeks. It's great. You feel good, but there's no way there's not fatigue under the hood. So the body needs oscillation. Taking a few days to just run easy and recover, that gives you the space you need to actually step back in to training and train hard to ensure that you don't get injured and to ensure that you're going to actually recover adequately so you get the adaptations that we're attempting to get here in the process.
Yeah, another one that I see a lot is people who become obsessed with race pace or I need to train at race pace to get better at race pace, which yes, but you don't want to conflate specificity with exclusivity. You do need race specific work, but only in the right phase and in the right volume. Building your aerobic base and threshold capacity produces speed at race effort. You're not slow because you don't run at race pace enough. You're slow because your engine isn't big enough.
I love that.
Build the engine.
All right. Practical takeaways here. Guys, you don't need to memorize the name of all of these fancy things and scientific jargon that
Though
we
if
mentioned.
you do, you can absolutely ruin your next hinge date.
Well, I'm not going to be dating in this mesocycle.
That's so nice to hear.
What you need, what I really want to drive home for folks is understanding the concepts that we've highlighted here. What phases of training are most important? How do you want to periodize things? How do you protect your easy days and make sure they're super easy? How to actually ensure that the hard work is hard? How do you build in meaningful recovery?
Yeah. So before you ask what workout should I do today, ask yourself what phase am I in and what does this phase need from me? Again, this is really where having a coach who can look big picture makes sense. Even if you think you understand how to structure workouts and how to even if you, by the grace of God, are one of the 3 people on planet Earth who truly understands how to run easy, congratulations. Please send me a DM. If you're not thinking big picture, you can undermine all of that knowledge by not being intentional both in the micro and the macro. So a good, really meaningful training year isn't a series of discrete hard weeks. It's a sequence of intentional phases that are in communication with one another, each building the foundation for the next one and ideally leading to your event. So athletes who continue to get better year over year aren't the ones who found the perfect workout, can just bang it out on repeat. They're the ones who understand how to respect the architecture.
Love it. Well, thanks, guys. I hope you found this, helpful and educational and informative. Take these takeaways into your training. It's not too late to make adjustments and begin to really periodize and block out these specific competencies so you can actually get better. As always, microcosmcoaching@gmail.com, and you can check out all of our coaching offerings at microcosm-coaching.com. And we'll see you guys next week.